Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In the first segment of today's show, we're going to discuss a statement that the Russian General Staff, the chair of the Russian General Staff, I should say, Valery Gerasimov, made in an end-year briefing to foreign military attaches in the Russian capital, Moscow. He said that NATO's intensified drills this year, i.e. 2019, are an indication that the bloc is in fact preparing for major conflict. Now, as you well know, Russia has always complained about NATO expansion close to its borders, saying that all these sorts of drills close to its borders are always an indication of aggression that Russia must defend itself against at some level. To discuss that a bit further, we're joined now by our panelist, Adriel Zonta, who is a foreign affairs analyst. He's a political consultant as well. He's joining us from London. Joining us from the Russian capital itself is Andrei Kortunov, who is the Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council. And joining us from The Hague is Ron Keller, who's a former Dutch ambassador in Russia and former top advisor at EU and Dutch Ministries of Finance and Foreign Affairs. Ron, Andrei, and Adriel, thank you to all three of you for your time today. Andrei Kortunov, let me start with you. What do you make of this statement of the chair of the Russian General Staff? Do you also believe that NATO is preparing for an invasion or for major conflict of some sort?
Well, I think that the military usually talks about capabilities rather than intentions. And of course, in the Russian General Staff, they look at the NATO budget, which is growing. They look at the military infrastructure of NATO in Europe, which is getting enhanced. And they are concerned not about the immediate intentions of NATO, but I think rather about long-term changes in the NATO capabilities. And the perception is that probably now NATO is not looking for a conflict, but we don't know what will happen in midterm, long-term future.
All right, so Ron, what do you make of that? Because NATO would say that, listen, we're just holding these exercises in countries, former countries that were part of the Soviet Union, for example, at times, because those countries themselves have requested our help in some regards. Is that a good enough reason, or do you think this does show long-term intention or even mid to long-term intention about a possible conflict with Russia?
Well, let me first say, Waqar, that NATO's expansion is largely due to the fact that the countries concerned, the countries in Central and Eastern Europe that have joined NATO over the last decades, strongly wish that themselves. So it's not some kind of a devious plan from Washington or anywhere else. It is an organic process based on the strong wish and desire of those countries that have joined NATO to be part of a defensive, and I underline defensive, alliance. This is number one. Number two, yes, there has been debate about NATO's budget, mainly inspired by President Trump, who feels that the burden sharing in NATO is not good enough. Now, this fits into his overall agenda of coming stronger, fighting for American interests. And he did raise an issue about the burden sharing, which is long already on the table. Allies are looking at it, and we try to discuss with the Americans how to do that. Doesn't mean that there is a structural increase of NATO's budget foreseen, and certainly not that this is all aimed to start to become offensive, which would be in violation of NATO's charter and would be completely outside of NATO's interest. Nobody wants a conflict with Russia. Nobody wants to go at war. And the exercises are going on year after year. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, they have been scaled down. This year's exercise actually are in numbers fewer than last year's and the year before's exercises. Okay. So I don't think there's really a stepping up. I say one more sentence. What General Gerasimov is pointing at, I think Mr. Kortunov is right. It's about capabilities more than an actual threat. And the NATO exercise that he refers to is one that is held every other 5 or 6 or 7 years about the interoperability of NATO. This is not the biggest NATO exercise ever held. It is, after the fall of the wall, the third largest. So it fits into a pattern of defense.
Right. So let's talk about capability, Adriel. Just hypothetically, I'm going to throw this out there because I wonder if NATO were to feel one day that it has significant more capability than the Russian army. Do you think it would want to enter into major conflict with Russia?
I'm not sure because there are two different theories. One theory says that China has become for NATO what the Russia was before, so that would challenge that logic in terms of going against China and at the same time trying to poke the Russian bear and seeking a conflict. As the previous commentator said, it is not true that the NATO is not, preparing itself for the fight either with China or with Russia, but it's most definitely provoking Russia by these military actions, and I assume that if we try to apply the very same logic, if Russia, for instance, would place its bases in Cuba and surrounded United States of America with its bases, I'm sure that the previous commentator and those who are trying to seek find out an excuse, excuses for the United States and the NATO to condemn this military actions and exercises and placing the NATO bases around Russia. I think that the very same concern would be expressed by the United States and the Western allies. So for me, as a person who was born and raised in Poland, it posed a certain question because many scholars and public intellectuals are saying that we shouldn't be afraid, and there are no signs inside that we should, be afraid of Russia or the Russia is posing any threat. Quite contrary to this particular notion is that it is in our best interest in Central Eastern Europe to have good relations with Russia, but exercising and taking part in the exercises, military exercises, which are aiming at somehow afraid Russia or threaten Russia's security might slightly end up differently than those who are advocating for NATO exercising envision that.
Okay.
And we know that from the history how this end up for the Central European countries, including Poland.
Okay, so Andrei Kortunov, I wonder, do you think that the Russia at some level is also to blame for this sort of tension at this time? Because many would say that Russia has been taking more of an aggressive stance in some regards. Just within the country, the military drills that have happened just within Russian borders have been massive if you add them all up, really. And then when Russia then complains about NATO exercises, which, as Ron had also said, it is those very countries that have sort of asked for NATO's help, then why would Russia complain about that? So, it's sort of a two-way street here, right? It's not as simple as just saying, listen, it's NATO's fault, it's NATO that is being the aggressor here.
Well, I think that you are right, and we have people and institutions and interest groups which profit from the current situation between Russia and the West, and they believe that the situation is fine, that a certain degree of tension is affordable, and that they can control the situation without allowing it to escalate to a level when it becomes really dangerous. So they usually support each other, if you wish, and therefore we don't have confidence-building measures. We don't have a real dialogue between Russia and NATO. Unfortunately, the NATO-Russia Council is almost paralyzed. And I think that constitutes a real problem because we don't know whether they are in a position to control the escalation. And a war in Europe can happen not because someone wants to wage a war in Europe, but simply because of a human error or inadvertent escalation, something that happened on the continent 100 years ago when the First World War started, although nobody really wanted to wage a big war.
All right, so then do you think that, I don't know if I may stay with you, that Russia needs to do more than to reach out and control the situation before it possibly, again, this is all hypothetical, but it could get out of hand?
Well, I think that you're right, though, of course, politicians in Moscow would say that we have already stated our intention to reach out. For example, Putin stated that he would like to have a moratorium on the deployment of mid-range and short-range missiles in Europe. It is the West which should do more. The ball is in their court. But I agree that both sides should double their efforts to get out of the current situation.
Okay, so Ron, what do you make? Because again, it's easy, isn't it, Ron, to just get into the one side point of view on this. Do you think that NATO also and member states of NATO within Europe also need to take a step towards Russia and hand out an olive branch possibly?
Yes, I fully agree with the previous speaker on this, and I very much would like to emphasize the need to de-escalate in Europe. It's no use that we build up tensions. There are no territorial claims one way or the other. There are no ideological rifts anymore. It is absolutely useless to step up from both sides this demonizing atmosphere which we had in the Cold War and never really served anybody's interest. And I fully agree with earlier speaker that Central Europe is the one that was actually suffering from that. It's actually nobody's interest. All have a responsibility. Bear in mind that what happened in Ukraine and what happens in Ukraine is something which is, of course, by international community not accepted, the annexation of the Crimea and what happens in Donetsk. But bear in mind that here, too, there are two sides of the coin. We in the West, NATO, has offered Ukraine a NATO membership, mostly against its wishes and against its capability, and serving basically only to drive Russia into a corner. And I'm talking about 10, 15 years ago when this happened. So both sides have, unfortunately, engaged into escalations which are unproductive. And I think it is not productive to step up military efforts, including exercises. Neither is it very wise to demonize those efforts and to scaremonger Russian people or international community about NATO's intention. Both sides have to scale down. We've learned enough about conflicts and the devastatingly negative effects of those.
Indeed. Well, there's our final comment, but of course we appreciate all three of you, Ron, Andre, and Adriel, for your time, and of course for putting this into context for us, because this is an important issue. Tensions between NATO and Russia are certainly not new, or especially if we put it into context of what's been happening around the world vis-a-vis pressures upon Russia, be it in Venezuela, be it in Syria, be it otherwise, even in the United States with Russia collusion, etc. All of that adds into this sort of context and this pressure that Russia is feeling, along with, of course, as I said, NATO expansion also. And then you have these military drills, which in context to the drills that Russia holds are fairly small, but yet Russia sees them on its doorstep and asks why. And as Andrei Kortunov there mentioned, what the Russian General Staff, the chair of the Russian General Staff may have meant is not necessarily NATO intention to attack, but it's certainly planning for a major conflict at some point in time in the mid to long-term future. And that in and of itself is worrisome and should be stopped and paused before it possibly gets out of hand. We'll keep a close eye, of course, on that here in Scope. I'll be back, though, with my next segment after this break. Stay tuned. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment of today's show, we're going to discuss how the U.S. Senate has approved a bill that allows for the imposition of sanctions on German entities over Nord Stream 2. That is the Russian gas pipeline that will be coming directly into Europe, specifically, of course, Germany as well. Germany would of course, benefit in large regards when it comes to this gas pipeline, as it is dependent to quite an extent on Russian energy that country provides it. Angela Merkel has at this time insisted that Berlin will not give in to the pressure from Washington at this time to cancel that project. On top of all of this, in brackets, one must add the fact that a lot of the American energy companies have been wanting to sell their gas to European countries, and they're kind of annoyed that the Russians would swoop in and take their market share possibly for gas, which is, mind you, more expensive. That's at least what we've understood, that the American gas and American energy to be sold to Europe would be significantly more expensive. So the Russians then obviously have responded, saying that this is in fact an issue of unfair competition, that the Americans are trying to gain the market on their own through an unfair advantage. Let's discuss that a bit further. We're joined now by Gilbert Doctorow, who is an independent international affairs analyst with a focus on Russia, about which he's in fact published 4 books. He's joining us currently from Brussels in Belgium. We're also joined by Mark Sloboda, who is joining us from Moscow. He's an international affairs analyst and security analyst as well. He's a senior lecturer in international relations and security studies. He's also a U.S. Navy veteran. Mark and Gilbert, thank you both for your time today. Gilbert, let me start with you. What do you make of these sanctions as being placed on these German entities simply for signing up to Nord Stream 2? Is this, as Russia says, an issue of unfair competition?
Well, I think it would be a mistake to view these sanctions solely in the context of commercial competition. The reality is it is geopolitical competition, and the sanctions are part of a very broad program of the United States' efforts to sabotage the Russian economy, to stigmatize Russia, to isolate Russia, and to prevent the reemergence of a serious competitor on the global stage for managing international questions. Russia has come back, it would seem, under Vladimir Putin, to the consternation of many in the American political establishment who would like the days of the 1990s, when the United States enjoyed its unique position as the sole surviving superpower. It would like to maintain that, despite all the facts pointing to the impossibility of doing it. So this particular measure, which is, everyone agrees, is unlikely to have any great practical effect because the project is nearly complete, and what little remains to be done, the Russians can, in a pinch, do themselves without any outside pipe-laying ships. This particular measure is part of a large program to harm the Russian economy. So far, to very little effect, but I have to say there are 2 aspects to harming the Russian economy. The first is the direct damage caused by any given restriction of access to finance or to technology or whatever else. The second is the damage to the Russian economy that results from the protective measures that the Russian financial managers have to take to ensure that what is being done against them cannot cause a collapse or some systemic failure in the Russian economy. As a result of that, for example, the Russian National Bank has not been dropping interest rates as quickly as possible, dictated by the relatively low inflation of the country.
Sure. Let me just get Mark in on this, if you allow me. Mark, do you think that at some level that it's interesting that Germany would in fact side seemingly with Russia on this issue? Because as we know, in recent weeks, in fact, German-Russian relations haven't actually been very good. But do you think that America has stepped so far now that even its European allies are now saying, no, this is just too much?
Yeah, I don't think it's actually a surprise that Germany is siding with Russia on this, because Germany and Russia, and before Russia, the Soviet Union, have been energy partners, suppliers and consumers, reliable to each other for decades. This isn't a case of Russia swooping in to the market. This is, if anything, the U.S. trying to swoop in with their LNG, which unfortunately is twice as expensive and will never be as reliable as pipelines. These pipelines are actually replicating what already exists and flows through Ukraine, and to a lesser extent through Poland and on to Germany. These pipelines, Nord Stream 1, and already completed, and now Nord Stream 2, undergoing the Baltic, are meant to circumvent Ukraine as a potential problem in the supply of energy from as an energy hub and distribute, this gas. Russia supplies almost 40% of the EU's gas needs already, which is vitally important as the EU, particularly the dirtier countries of Eastern Europe, attempt to move away from coal, which is a far more polluting fossil fuel, particularly carbon-wise, with regards to climate change. Now, this sanctions bill will also sanction, ineffectively, Turkstream, which is a pipeline flowing from Russia to Turkey, which will open already in January. And the thing about these, I agree with everything Professor Doctorow said. This is both geopolitics and business, heavier on the geopolitics angle, perhaps. But I would add on to what he said that everyone knows that this gesture is futile. It's not going to stop Russia. Even more so, this is solely a vindictive gesture. The U.S. knows that this isn't going to stop the pipeline. If they had wanted to stop the pipeline, they would have done so.
Okay.
Earlier. Instituted harsher sanctions that were considered, like sanctioning Russian debt, sanctioning the financial investors, sanctioning the import of the equipment used to construct and build the pipelines. They didn't do this. This is just a gesture of outrage of the U.S. blob, the foreign policy elites, which is against Russia, fulfilling the need to do something to express outrage about Russia. But the U.S. ultimately is unwilling to try to dictate Germany's sovereignty and energy security, knowing the rift that would cause between the U.S. and the EU. They're not willing to go that line. And that's why this gesture is not going to do or change anything, and everyone knows it.
Okay, so on that point then, Gilbert, I'll go back to you because, you're sitting in Brussels, which is the heart of the EU, really. And do you think that at some level the EU is finally coming to the realization, or has already come to the realization not too long ago, that the U.S. cannot always be trusted as a partner, be it when it comes to its energy needs or even really politically? I mean, right now we still have the EU, at least on the outside, saying it wants to remain in the Iran nuclear deal, for example. I'm just bringing that up because, again, it shows a further division, doesn't it, between the EU and the U.S.? And do you think that these sort of divisions will only grow between the two sides?
Well, the song that we hear repeatedly coming from Washington is that the Russians sow dissent and discord among the Europeans. That is a melody that's played on the violin every time you tune into Washington. However, the reality is that the European Union is internally divided because the interests of the respective states are very much at variance in many, many areas, including defense, including policy towards Russia. And until there is a substantial change in the structure of the way the EU operates, that division and frustration at the more or less impotence of the European Union will continue. In this regard, there was the most interesting challenge to the status quo has been issued ever since, for the last 4 or 5 months, by Emmanuel Macron, who is calling, among other things, aside from his direct appeal for rapprochement with Russia as a potential partner, in the formation of a tripolar world, as opposed to the present bipolar world, bipolar meaning China and the United States, with Europe as a junior partner to the United States, and with Russia as a junior partner to China, to create a third force, which would be essentially Russia and the EU. Well, that is one very big feature of his attempt to break out of the present box of inaction and of contraring views within the EU when complete assent or unanimity is required for to do almost anything. The underlying principle, if the EU is to become a force in the world, is for there to be a recognition that there are core countries and there are other countries in the EU member states who are less important and who are less engaged in decision making. Until that happens, we will see the ongoing stasis and just the verbal wrangling and frustration, which you were mentioning a couple of minutes ago.
Yeah, so Mark, I wonder, the issue of Ukraine obviously hanging over the head of EU-Russia relations. Do you think that issue will be soon resolved to the satisfaction of both sides? Because I would guess that is the main stumbling block to even better relations.
Yeah, I mean, the relations with Ukraine have been a problem in Russian EU and Russian U.S. relations ever since the West backed Maidan Putsch overthrew the democratically elected Ukrainian 2014, and that. Conflict continues to this day with the Ukrainian civil war, the civil conflict in East Ukraine in the Donbass. I do not expect that conflict will be resolved anytime soon. I do not believe that the new Ukrainian, the president of the U.S.-backed Kiev regime in Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, has either the desire or to politically reconcile with Donbass and the ability to reintegrate it into Ukraine. I think that we will see probably more of a settled frozen conflict, perhaps somewhat more amicable, with a greater trade with their biggest trading partner, which is still Russia. But I think that you will see a continuation of a frozen conflict with the Donetsk and Lugansk republics.
But Mark, to be fair, France and Germany are trying, aren't they, to try to mediate something? I mean, there was that meeting recently, which France and Germany hosted between the Ukrainian and Russian leaders as well.
I think that is largely a shall we say, a diplomatic gesture met towards other things such as energy security and so on. They know that the regime in Kiev, Zelensky, is unwilling to implement Minsk. He has said so repeatedly. He denies the basic terms of it. He says it has to be reformulated. Russia and the Donetsk and Lugansk republics are not willing to do so. The long-term political reconciliation is simply not going to happen. Everyone is looking forward to, again, a simply more amicable frozen conflict.
All right, let me thank Gilbert and Mark for their time today. And of course, we appreciate them putting this into context for us. This issue of the U.S. Senate approving these sanctions on German entities simply for working with the Nord Stream 2 pipeline project. Of course, that project will bring Russian gas into Europe. It's something interesting because it's also about unfair competition, as a Russian official said, because America is also looking to sell its LNG to Europe, but of course at double the price, as Mark had described. Also, we'll keep a close eye on this because Germany right now, as I said, has stood up for itself and said, no, we're not going to walk away from this project. We're not going to give in to U.S. pressure. So what happens next then? We'll keep a close eye on that. As I said, I'll be back though with my final segment after this break. Stay tuned. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In today's final segment, we're going to discuss the Trump impeachment process. Now, I'm going to hone in on two interesting pieces of news. One is that less than half of all Americans say that Donald Trump should be removed from office following his impeachment, as you know, by the U.S. House of Representatives. This is according to the latest Reuters Ipsos opinion poll that's been released on Thursday. That will, of course, present a challenge for Democrats who seek his ouster through a U.S. Senate trial, which is, of course, unlikely to happen because the U.S. Senate is controlled essentially by the Republicans. Now, another interesting piece of news, of course, is the fact that Nancy Pelosi, who is a Democrat, is delaying sending the impeachment articles to the Senate. She wants more clarity on the rules of the Senate trial. There is this back and forth right now between Mitch McConnell and her. But according to constitutional scholars, there's actually no obligation for the House to, in fact, even send the articles of impeachment to the Senate to trigger a trial. It would be unprecedented, but it's not unconstitutional. Let's discuss that a bit further. We're joined now by Mark Moritz, who is a professor at the State University of New York Maritime College. He is also a political analyst, and he's joining us from New York. Also joining us is Nina Birdie, who has been published in Newsweek. She's a political journalist. She's also been published in NBC, Rolling Stone, and Medium. Is also a best-selling author, most recently, of Golden Handcuffs, The Secret History of Trump's Women. And she is joining us from the U.S. as well. Nina and Mark, thank you both for your time today. Nina, let me start with you, if I may. What do you make of the latest Reuters poll about less than half of Americans saying that Trump should, in fact, be removed from office following that impeachment by the U.S. House?
Well, I think Americans are busy. They're fed up with the chaos. And frankly, I was just talking to somebody about this last night, another liberal friend in New York at a liberal gathering, that, we have to admit, at least here in New York, that, our lives have not been changed dramatically by the Trump presidency in a bad way. We have not been personally affected, other than having everybody we know in a kind of a panic that this vulgarian, corrupt person is now in charge of the government. And I think that may be true for a lot of Americans. So I think that's one of the issues. How has your life changed? The economy is still humming along. The fact that the Constitution is being trod upon, that there are abuses of power, that there's corruption, that doesn't affect people in a day-to-day basis. The fact that the United States is not taking the lead on climate change, that's not affecting people in the out in the countryside. And, the economy continues to hum along. So I think people are not, they're not affected. And, it's a holiday time and people are distracted. And, I think his 2020 prospects, it remains to be seen how this plays out. But I think there's kind of a, go on, ask Mark.
Sure. Yeah. Mark, I wanted to get your thoughts on what Nina said. Do you think at some level that this will, in fact, become quite a significant challenge for Democrats? How do you get Americans to connect with this issue at this time?
America's not connected with it. The Democrats have made a foolish misstep, an utter error, and they've tampered with the Constitution, in my opinion, in many respects. First of all, the process in the House was totally inappropriate, starting with the Intelligence Committee, rushing to vote to impeach a president with 5-minute votes. But let me pick up on Nina's point, because her point was very important. The atmosphere around this impeachment is very telling. I remember the atmosphere around the Nixon impeachment. People were riveted by the Nixon impeachment, by the hearings. People listened to it, followed it. Nobody's following this, and the reason is because there's nothing to it. I would say that if you looked around while the House was voting, which is a pivotal event in American history, what were people doing? They were doing holiday shopping. What was the economy doing? It was doing just fine, because the people are not invested. Now, the folly, the foolishness has now been exacerbated by Speaker Pelosi, by her ridiculous statement that she's not going to send the articles of impeachment over to the Senate until she knows what the rules are going to be. Well, I have my Constitution with me here today, and what that says is very clear. The House has the power to impeach, but the Senate has the sole power to try impeachments. And by the way, the Wall Street Journal today proposes that McConnell give Pelosi a deadline and say to her, either you give me the article, the managers to come over and present the case, or I'm going to go ahead with it. Last point, very important. We have a number of U.S. senators who are running for president. When the conviction trial takes place, they have to sit there every day from 9 to 5 and listen to this, and they can't talk, and they cannot campaign. I assure you that they will pressure Pelosi to get this thing over with, because the end result is inevitable. Inevitable. This has been a waste of time. The people have not invested in it. And the bottom line is the people know a folly and a foolishness. The people always know better. And they think this thing is just ridiculous. And I think the candidates are going to pressure her, because they're not going to allow her to push it along. They want to get it in and out, do it, finish it off, so they can go out and campaign and ultimately, try to run for president. That's how I see it.
Okay, so Nina, what are your thoughts on that? Because I would imagine that this goes to show, as even this poll that I referred to in my first question to you shows as well, that the public is divided, and the voting bases on both sides, be they pro-Trump or anti-Trump and pro-Democrat, they're stuck in their respective positions. So who's really gaining anything from this? I mean, the prospects for 2020 seem, at this point in time, not being too affected specifically by this impeachment process?
Well, first of all, it's I mean, I would argue that it's not folly that they did this. I mean, you know, clearly there has been massive corruption in this administration, abuse of power, obstruction of justice by withholding witnesses. You know, those are not good precedents. These you know, kind of abuses of executive power that have been going on, those are not good things. They're not good precedents for our country. It's not good to treat the Constitution that way. So it wasn't folly. It's not folly to object to withholding almost $400 million in aid just to get a foreign government to look like they're investigating your chief possible opponent in domestic politics. But that said, you know, you're right. I mean, we are a divided country. It's not that 100% of Americans were not paying attention. Half weren't. You know, the numbers are, it's divided evenly down the middle. I think it's 48 to 48 you know, 48 are for him being impeached and removed from office, and 48 are not. And then when you look at the parties, 90% of Republicans say, keep him in, he's great. 83% of Democrats are saying, no, get him out. So it's divided. And I would argue as a journalist that one of the problems is that we're so siloed off in terms of what the facts are. We don't agree on a reality anymore. And that's a problem.
Yeah, so I mean, do you not think that, Nina, sticking with you for a moment, that brats also have some blame to share when it comes to not being able to get all Americans or many Americans on board?
Well, sure. I mean, everybody shares the blame. I think, you know, a lot of it has to do with where people are getting their information, the proliferation of fake news on social media, you know, the Zuckerbergs of the world, the techno-utopians who think, you know, who throw around the term the First Amendment to excuse people putting fake news and lies into the social media stream, and then letting Americans pass that around because Americans are busy. Americans have things to do. The reason Americans are so busy and distracted is because they don't have health insurance, and they don't have, you know, this is a difficult country to live in. There's no social net, and so people are very, very busy. They have 5 minutes a day to turn on the TV before they run off to one of their two jobs. They're watching TV. So if you turn Fox News on, which half of the people are doing, you're only getting one point of view. You're getting this propaganda. Now, that said, yes, there's propaganda spewing out of MSNBC as well. So people don't know they've lost sort of this agreement. We've lost an agreement on what the reality is, what the facts are. And this is a problem all over.
Nina, I'm going to cut you off. I do apologize just because we're quickly running out of time, and I just wanted to let for the final 1 minute, if I may. Mark, I'm getting this extra time from my producer right now. I just wanted to get your final thoughts on that point that I made there about a divided country. Both parties have blame to share in this regard, don't they? That they haven't been able to convince a majority of Americans of their point of view. Why is that?
It's that we're a divided country. Well, that's fine. But the problem is that when you impeach a president the way this is being done, you lower the bar for impeachment forever. And, you know, and we don't have time to go into the history of the Andrew Johnson impeachment, the Nixon impeachment. I could tell you that the Nixon impeachment really he didn't get impeached. He resigned. And why was that? It wasn't the Democrats. It was the Republicans who lost support for Nixon. In this case, yeah, the country's divided, and you were quoting from polls. You know, polls have a margin of error. The bottom line is Trump was elected president by the Electoral College, and Democrats don't accept that, okay? And they've been trying to take him out since the day he walked in. It's absolutely true. Now, if you look at the historical precedents, Look at obstruction of Congress, the second article of impeachment. That is completely ridiculous, because what it means is that they impeached the president because he said he would not produce witnesses. Well, then they should have gone to the court, but they didn't go to the Supreme Court. No, they impeached him. So they massaged and they really brutalized the rules in order to get an impeachment. Because Pelosi, by the way, said it should be bipartisan, but it wasn't. So I don't think they were right. And now look at the result. Now they're waiting to send it over because they know inevitably what's going to happen to it. It's going to get short shrift in the Senate.
Very well.
You know, it's a political activity, but not one, because honestly, I have to tell you, there would have been, on this basis, they would have been impeaching every single president for something over the history of this country, and that is misusing this constitutional right. So I don't accept it at all, and I think the people don't either. Democrats and Republicans, by the way, I don't think they accept it. The people always know better, and they don't like it. That's what I think.
Okay. Well, we really appreciate you sharing your insights. We'll conclude at that. But of course, we appreciate, as I said, Mark and Nina for taking their time out this morning. They're speaking to us from New York, respectively. Viewers, this issue of the Trump impeachment is divisive. Both of our guests gave you the opposing points of view on this issue. But that is what this issue has done. That is what this Trump presidency has been like from day one. It's been a presidency of division. Whether it's his fault or not is up for argument, certainly, and whether or not he has, in fact, committed acts which are criminal and should hold them to account via a Senate trial. That is, of course, something that has to be debated. There has to, in fact, be a trial in the Senate to begin with. The House has to send those articles of impeachment to begin with. Nancy Pelosi has to make that decision at some point in time that the process will not be in her hands once it is handed over to the Senate, because the Senate is controlled by Republicans, whether she likes it and other Democrats like it or not. And none of this is really affecting the 2020 elections either, by the way. So the polls are stuck in time, essentially, with Democrats and Republicans stuck in their respective positions. What does this mean for the country going forward, especially for those elections as well? We'll keep a close eye on that, of course, here in Scope. I'll leave it there for now, though. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.